Hello and welcome to Marriage and Family in a Global Context. This is Class 4, History of the Family, Part 1. It's a two-parter, so be sure to watch both parts. You get a full picture of the history of the family. Before we get started, I just want to remind you and do sort of a shameless plug for my virtual office hours. They are Tuesdays and Fridays from 1 to 2:30 p.m. Central Time. You can access them on Zoom, so you don't have to risk infection and come to campus. It's all virtual. If you go to the modules page on our Canvas and then go down to connect with the instructor, there's a link there for the Zoom. You should be able to click it and it should take you right to the waiting room. I was like 5 minutes late to my office hours on Friday. I will try not to be late, but I'm not very good with time. But just email me if you're having trouble getting to office hours. I'm happy to work with you and to help you figure it out. We can figure it out together because I still am not perfectly acclimated to Zoom. You can attend these office hours for any reason. If you have questions about class, you want to talk about assignments, or you just are bored and you want to talk to someone about your career goals, your interests in HDFS, this time is for you to take advantage of having a mentor and an instructor. So please come visit me for whatever reason. I'm happy to talk to you. And anybody can do this. Anyone who's enrolled in the course is welcome to come to virtual office hours. Don't be shy or embarrassed. Don't feel like only people who are struggling in the course come to see their instructors. I graduated from Auburn with a bachelor's degree and a 3.98 GPA, and I went to office hours a lot. It's a great way to meet professors. It's a great way to learn more about your field, and it's a great way to make connections with people in your field. These are standing hours, so you don't need an appointment. You don't even need to let me know if you're coming. But if you are planning to come and you want to drop me a quick email and let me know when you're planning on coming, I'll be sure to be there. I kind of dipped out for a little bit on Friday because I was hungry, so I went and made some food. And so if I knew you were coming at 2:15, then I probably wouldn't have dipped out at 2:15. But you don't have to let me know. I will be there the entire time. But I may step away from the computer. If this time doesn't work for you, I know some of you are as far away as California, some of you are in Florida or Georgia, so you're in different time zones, and these times don't work for you, then just email me and we can set up an individual meeting at a time that works for you. It doesn't matter to me at all. Just be sure to take advantage of having this time to ask questions and to get clarifications on things that maybe you don't understand. Don't wait until the exam review or till after the exam to ask questions about things you don't understand. All right, so let's review. Before we get started on the history of the family, part 1, let's review what we talked about in class 3, which was how we study families. And in class 3, we learned about the ways that theories provide a way of thinking about families. So theories aren't answers, they're just ways of understanding or ways of asking questions, ways of thinking, ways of designing studies. And once we established that, we identified some major perspectives and theories about the family. So some of those perspectives were like conflict or consensus perspective. Some of the theories were feminist theory, exchange theory, symbolic interaction theory. We even talked about some new perspectives like the life course perspective or the demography perspective. So we learned about some of the ways that we have thought about families in the past, some of the ways that we are thinking about families now as family scientists. Then we transitioned into reviewing the scientific method as a standard for testing theory-driven hypotheses. So once we have this way of thinking, how do we use it to understand and come and discover facts about families? And then we discovered different methods or explored different methods for testing hypotheses. So like sampling or doing in-depth interviews or time use journals. Those are different methods that we talked about for testing hypotheses. So before we move on to this new material, I want you to pause the video and I want you to think about this. I want you to do this little quick assignment because this is a really good way to test your own knowledge of what you've learned and make sure that you understand it. So take a pause. I want you to pick a major theory that we talked about last time and quickly summarize it to yourself. Think about how that theory would answer the question, why do so many marriages end in divorce? So pause the video, pick a theory, quickly summarize what it proposes about families, and then think about how a theorist with that perspective would answer this question. So as we move forward in our study of family, we can't really understand what family means today without understanding the roots of that meaning. And we can't understand the roots without understanding the history of family. So as we talk about the history of family in this class and next class, we're going to be focusing more heavily on the American family, not because it's the best family or because it's the only kind of family, but because most of us in this class are Americans, and our understanding of family is going to be an American understanding of family. So in order to understand how we understand families, we have to also know where we come from and where that perception of families, what informs that perception of families. Now, one thing that is common across all cultures and all times are the structures of family and the functions of family. What does that mean? Well, the structures, like the trunk of a tree, are the things that hold family together, hold them up, make them exist. The functions, sort of like the branch of a tree, are the role that family plays in the lives of the individual members of the family, but also in society as a whole. So, like, the branches of a tree are very important because they provide shade. That's a function. They also provide a means for the tree to survive because they hold the leaves that produce the energy that the tree needs to survive through photosynthesis. And so that's sort of a metaphor that I want you to think about as we move forward and we talk about these family structures and functions. So across cultures and across time, so this is not just applicable to the American family, it's pretty much any family in any culture at any time point from the beginning of human beings until the end of human beings. We assume, I mean, it could change, but to date, these structures have been consistent from the time of our existence. One of the things that we notice across time and culture is that family structure is intrinsically tied to the partnering of parents. So parents are an important part of family structure. And I'm going to put a caveat in there that parents don't necessarily mean like your biological parents. It's the people who play the role of parent in your life. So your guardians would be your parents in the sense of the importance of family structure. And so because parents are important to the family structure, the way they're partnered is also important. And there are two major types of partnering that we see across time and culture. And the first is monogamy, and this is marriage between two partners. They could be two partners of the same sex or opposite sex. Monogamy just means two people are married to one another or are partnered to one another in a permanent way or a quasi-permanent way. Now, monogamy is very common now, but it has actually not been the most common or the most widespread form of partnering across time and culture. The most common type and the most widespread type is polygamy, which is marriage between multiple partners. And it wasn't until the last several hundred years or so that polygamy has become something that is very rare. Today, it represents a very small percentage of partnerings, and monogamy is much more the norm. But historically, polygamy has been the primary mode of partnering, both longer and more widespread across culture. Now, partnering isn't the only important part of family structure. It's also how the family is composed. And there are two different types of families that we see across time and culture. The first is the nuclear family, and this is largely held up as the standard or the stable family in American culture, though it's not necessarily the way that it's done or the standard or the most stable across not just in our culture but across cultures. The nuclear family is a monogamous couple and their children living together with no extended family members. So if you live with your biological parents and your biological siblings, That is your nuclear family. Um, but there are no extended family members living with you. So a nuclear family cannot by definition be a polygamous with have a polygamous coupling because people who are not related to one another by marriage or blood um, are not living together. I would argue though that if you're adopted, then the people that have adopted you, they've assumed your parental role, that would still be your nuclear family. Your extended family or an extended family is a family of related members, so like grandparents, adult children, or siblings, and their children living together in a single household. And this is very common in a lot of cultures. You have a mom and a dad and their children, and maybe the mom or the dad's parents live in the home, or the mom or the dad's siblings live in the home, or you have multiple generations living under one roof. That's very common in cultures in South America, in Central America, in Africa, and in Asia. It's not as common in North American families or in European families unless those families are immigrant in origin from these other places where it's much more common. But we also have to realize that as culture changes, as our definition of marriage changes, as our recognition of family structure changes, our terminology also changes. And so some new terms have emerged to define partnering and to define family. So heterogamy is when you have marriage between partners of the opposite sex. So most of us when we think about partnering, we're most likely going to think about heterogamy because it's much more common. Because until very recently, it was impossible and not legal to be married to someone of the same sex, and in some cases it was illegal even to live together in a coupling, um, or in a partnership with multiple people of the same sex. Homogamy is a marriage or partnering between partners of the same sex. So you could have a heterogamous monogamous relationship or a heterogamous polygamous relationship. So interesting way to think about, and an important way to think about family structures as we move forward as a society where we have a much more diverse understanding of marriage and partnering and family. But family structure isn't isolated. These structures exist for a reason, and that's because families play different functions in people's lives depending on what they need, what they want, and what culture they live in. Some of the commonalities we see in family function across time and culture is that the primary function of family is the accumulation and transmission of wealth and power. Now, that may seem very antithetical or very opposite of what we think about when we think of family. We think about families loving us and accepting us. But the reality is, even in 2020, this definition holds true. The primary function of a family is economic stability, because without economic stability, you often don't have emotional stability. You also often don't have social stability. Economic stability in a society that exists on the exchange of resources. I mean, any kind of relationship that you have has to be somewhat, in some way, based on the ability to exchange resources. And so the primary function is accumulation and transmission of wealth and power. So there are two different ways this could happen across time and culture. And the first is patrilineal, as a patrilineal family. And that's when, and really this is more of a society thing, not just an individual family. So patrilineal is when the legal or social structures allow for the transmission of wealth and power from father to son. So in Western culture, particularly Anglo-Saxon culture, which most of us are part of, there is a patrilineal, we live in a patrilineal society. That's why, ladies, we take our husband's last names often when we get married, because it's just the way that things are done, because our society is set up in a patrilineal way. Until 50 or so years ago, women didn't have the ability to accumulate wealth and power in the same way that they do now. And so your wealth and power was often derived from your husband, and so that's why you would take his name. And so some cultures are matrilineal, though, and that's when the legal or social transmission is from mother to daughter. This is much less common, especially in Western cultures. Um, Now, I want to highlight two important terms here, legal and or social. So legal transmission, or de jure by the law, is when the law says that you only inherit your wealth and power from father to son. Social transmission would be society agrees that that's how it's done. So these days, in 2020 in the United States, we don't have a de jure or a legal patrilineal society, but we do have a de facto or social patrilineal society. We still largely see the transmission of wealth and power of name from father to son, or from male to male. It doesn't mean that it's the only way that it happens, but it's still the predominant way that we see this transition, this function in society playing itself out. Now, because we have this difference in accumulation and transmission of wealth and power, we also have to understand that across time and culture, we've had differences in how wealth and power are held. How the people who were in charge, the people who have the rights and have the benefits attached to wealth. And when I say wealth, I don't just mean like being a billionaire. I mean having $10 in your pocket is wealth compared to someone who doesn't, right? So like who has the ability to earn money and spend money and have legal recognition for that money? This is what I'm talking about when I talk about wealth and power being held differently. And we see again two major structures. First, it's a patriarchal society. And maybe you've heard this term a lot. It comes up a lot, especially in modern feminism. The patriarchy. We live in a society that is governed by the patriarchy. What does that mean? That means that wealth and power are generally held by men. In the past, this was a legal situation. Now it's more of a social thing. It's just something that exists because men have had power and wealth longer than women have, and it takes a while for the culture to equalize. A matriarchal society is the opposite. That's when wealth and power is held by women. Now you might think, well, I've never heard of a matriarchal society. Well, it's because you live in a Western nation. Western nations have never had matriarchies. But matriarchies have existed on this continent before the arrival of European colonizers. Most, if not all, but many Native American cultures were matriarchal. And we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail in a moment. But the family function also differs by where family dwells, and this has changed and been the same and been different across time and culture. You can have a patrilocal family, that's a family where you dwell with or near the husband's family, or a matrilocal family, and that is when you dwell with or near the wife's family. In some Asian cultures, they're very patrilocal. You marry someone and you live in the household with his father and mother, and you're part of that family structure. And that's why in some Asian cultures, having male children is more valued than female children, because if you have sons, that means they're going to marry wives, and they're going to bring more labor and more resources into the family unit. And these dwelling arrangements sometimes are intrinsically attached to how wealth and power are held and how they're accumulated. So in some patrilocal societies, the oldest son lives with the father and mother, and his family lives with the father and mother, and he inherits all of their family wealth and social standing when the parents die, and he's responsible when the father dies for taking care of his mother. This is seen in a lot of Asian cultures, and seen in some African cultures, and seen in some Arab cultures. So this also used to be something that was very prevalent in Western society before women had the ability to hold wealth and to have their own political agency within society. So family function is very tied to these three different concepts of who holds money, how money is transmitted, and how you live together. So when thinking about the American family and the origin and the history of the American family, we have to think about where it came from. We didn't just we didn't just grow from nothing on this continent that we call North America. Most of us, myself included, are not original people. We're from North America because we were born here, but our ancestors were not. And so we have to look to where we came from to understand how we as a society have developed our concept of the family. So there are four different sources of family that we're going to consider when we in our understanding and as we lay our foundation for the history of the actual American family. So the first is obviously Europe. Most of us are European American, which means that our primary ancestry comes from the continent of Europe. Now, for Europeans, the origin of the family, so who defines family and who regulates family is the church, specifically the Roman Catholic Church, because until the mid 1500s, that was the only church that really existed in Western Europe. Now, the English Reformation changed that. A lot of us are Anglo-Saxon, meaning we come from the island of Great Britain, which was predominantly, the church was predominantly the Church of England or the Church of Scotland. And so there was a little bit of a difference there, but the definition of family was fairly consistent across Europe, regardless of the church that you were a part of. And so the church really played a huge role in defining who could get married and what that marriage would look like, how that marriage could be dissolved, if it could be dissolved, and what family looked like and what the role of family was in everyday life. Now, because the church was the origin of family, we can make a lot of generalizations about marriages and families in Europe because the institution that governed it was uniform across all nations. It'll become harder to make generalizations as we move westward because there was not a unifying institution like the church as we move westward towards what we call North America. Now, the purpose of marriage and the purpose of family in Europe was economic. You had to, if you were very wealthy, you wanted to marry people who were also very wealthy because if you did that, it combined your wealth and wealth equaled power. So the more wealth you had, the more power you had. If you were very poor, you didn't have any wealth to accumulate, but you had to labor from the day you were born until the day you were died. You were died. You labored from womb to tomb because if you didn't, then you would die earlier than you would have otherwise. There was nobody there to take care of you if you didn't work. So you had to marry someone who would be able to labor with you and produce children who could also themselves help with your labor. So marriage was economic no matter what social class you were from. If you were very wealthy, your marriages were often arranged. You didn't marry for love. In fact, to Europeans during this early, this sort of medieval, moving into the Renaissance period, moving into the Reformation period, you loved God, you didn't love your spouse, you didn't love your children. You cared about them, but love was something that they would not have even thought of loving their spouse or their kids in the way that we do. Love is something that you gave God, not people. So when you were very wealthy, your marriages were arranged. You would be limited in your choice to people of the same social class as you and with similar levels of wealth as you. And that would be the same if you were poor. You were limited to your own social class and really just the people that you were around. So even though it wasn't necessarily arranged in the way that we think of an arrangement, it was still arranged in the sense that you didn't have a very big pool to choose from. There wasn't a Tinder or an OkCupid or a Bumble. You basically married the people that you farmed next to, and you were very lucky if you actually liked them. There was no divorce. Divorce was only granted in very limited situations, and it was only allowed by a special dispensation from the Pope. So if you were poor, you were stuck with whoever you married until they died. And if you were rich, like Henry VIII is a perfect example, you still had a hard time convincing the Pope to let you get divorced. The structure of marriage was monogamous. Polygamous marriage did not exist in Europe, at least not in a legal sense. And it was patriarchal. Men held all of the wealth and all the power. Women had no wealth or power, and they had no political agency. So they were, allowed political franchisement because of their husband. If you weren't married, you had no political franchisement. And wealth was transmitted in a patrilineal way. So wealth went from father to son, and it was specifically father to oldest son. If you were a second or third son, you were very fortunate if you got anything. Um, and this is seen still in England, where titles, if you're part of the nobility, the title goes from father to oldest son. Very rarely, if the oldest child is a daughter, does she inherit a title. It skips to the next born child if that person's a son. So you could have a family where there are three kids, and the two oldest are girls, and it's the youngest child who inherits the wealth and the title because he's male. Still a very patrilineal society. The second source of the American family is the Native Americans, the people who are actually here, who actually organically sprung from the soils of this continent. And the origin of the family to Native Americans, and before I continue, I have to pause and say these are very vast generalizations. And because Native culture is very diverse, and there were like so many more nations than there were more European nations, it's harder to generalize because there wasn't a common institution like the church that kind of united them in terms of their definition of marriage and family. So these things that I'm telling you are vast generalizations that anthropologists generally agree upon when they talk about Native American families. So if you are Native and you're like, well, this isn't really like my culture, it's probably because your culture was more of an exception than a rule. And I apologize for the generalization. It would be impossible to talk about every single individual Native culture. So the origin typically for Native Americans of marriage and family was the community. How did the community define marriage? And how did the elders of the community define marriage and family and the role of marriage and family in the community? And so the community could be the tribe as a whole. It could be just the grouping of people that you're with. It just kind of depends on the culture of your individual nation. The purpose of marriage and family and for Native Americans also is economic, but it wasn't economic in necessarily the way that we think about it. It was more economic in the way that the marriage and the married partners and the family related to the cooperation of the whole community. These marriages were less arranged, and they were more relational. So, for example, the Lakota, which is the Native American nation that inhabited the area that's now North Dakota and South Dakota, and these are a grouping of people that I understand better than most because I used to live in North Dakota and I worked with a lot of Native Americans of the Lakota or Dakota or Nakota nation, but for them it was very relational. So like family was defined not by blood relation as much as whether or not the matriarch of your family, because it's a very matriarchal society, whether or not the matriarch accepted you as part of the family. So you could be a complete stranger from a completely different nation, and if the matriarch accepted you as her son or her daughter, then you were part of the family. Divorce also, so marriage existed, but it wasn't as like the bond wasn't as permanent as it was in Europe. The divorce was allowed. It wasn't like everybody was marrying and divorcing the way that they, as much as they wanted to, but it wasn't like you're bound to this person forever and ever, like without end. Like there was a way out. There was it was much easier to attain than it would have been in Europe. The structure of marriage, again, it varies by the nation that you belong to. They were usually monogamous, though. Polygamous marriages were not practiced as widespread among North American natives, but it still happened. It was still something that existed. They were also often matriarchal and often matrilineal. So in many native nations, even today, your membership in the nation, your citizenship in the nation is determined by whether or not your mother belonged to it, because it's a matrilineal society. Um, the one exception to the matriarchy that existed in most native cultures is that if they were to go to war, the men had more of a say on whether or not they went to war, because there was still a gender divide in the way that, and gender roles, and so the way that gender was performed and the roles that people played in society still existed along gendered lines, but because men were more likely to be the ones to fight, they had more of a say in whether or not they went to war, which I think makes sense. So the American family as we know it began when colonists from Europe came to North America, or what we call North America, and they had their first contact with Native Americans. Now, European colonists brought a lot of European ideals with them, and those ideals still inform how we understand the family today. So the origin of the colonial family was still the church, but it was a different church. Maybe it was the Church of England. Maybe it was the Congregational Church, which is heavily informed by Calvinism and the Calvinist understanding of human beings and the role of marriage and family. So, for example, I talked a lot about the Catholic view of family earlier. The Calvinist view of family is that every human being is totally depraved. So we're all prone to do evil things, and the best way to regulate our behavior is through these structures like the church and the family and marriage. So marriage, the church exists to make sure people are living the way God wants them to live. Marriages exist to control people's lust, and family exists as sort of a micro unit of heaven, where the husband is God's representative and he is subservient to the church, who's subservient to Jesus. And this sort of like hierarchy of power comes all the way from heaven, and it's ordained by God to make sure that people do the things that they're supposed to do and live the way that they're supposed to live. So the church was still a huge part of defining marriages and defining families in colonial America. The purpose still very economic. Um, you're living in a what to them was a new world, quote unquote. The society as they understood it, culture as they knew it, was not there. The economic structures that would have supported them in Europe were not there, and so you still had to make your marriage and your family work in such a way that secured your economic and social standing in this sort of very volatile or uncertain place. Even so, marriages were much less arranged. People had a little bit more of a choice, and divorce was very rare. Divorce was permissible in the Church of England under certain circumstances, but it was still very hard to get. Um, Still permissible in Calvinist churches or Puritan churches, but still very hard to get. People most likely would not um, get a divorce unless they absolutely had to. And usually it was because someone was unfaithful. The structure, monogamous, patriarchal, and patrilineal. There was not a lot of change in terms of the structure from Europe to the colonies, though we did see a lot more of what are called stem families, and that's when the oldest son or the favored son would live with the mom and dad, and his family would live with them after he got married, and he would inherit the wealth and the family farm and would carry on the family heritage and legacy. So we saw a lot of that, and that was much more unique to like colonial America than it would have been back in Europe. Now, there's a fourth source of family, and it's one that we have to talk about, but it's also the one that we know the least about. And that is the enslaved African families who were forced to come to North America by European colonists. The first enslaved Africans arrived on North America in 1619, and the slave trade continued across the Atlantic until the mid 1800s, and the domestic slave trade in North America continued until the late 1800s. And during this time period, this tragedy occurred where Western and Central Africans were forced from their homes into slavery. And we have to consider this as a source of family because a large percentage of our population are the ancestors of these enslaved African families. However, we don't really understand, it's hard to understand how um, the those families, those enslaved African families, looked like or maintained the family structures that they were used to in Africa. Because part of this tragedy of slavery was that their language and culture was suppressed and stripped from them. They lost their names, they lost their practices, they lost their religion, they lost everything that we consider to be part of what makes us unique as human individuals, and they were forced to be what the European colonists wanted them to be. And so we don't really know how African American families today are a reflection of their ancestral family roots. And that's a really, I think, incredibly sad, but it's also incredibly devastating for people of that heritage because there's this disconnection and sort of a lack of knowing, you know, you know where they came from. And for us as white Americans, we can think about like our roots in Europe and kind of understand ourselves through that lens, but African Americans don't have that same benefit. But it's still important that we consider this and we remember this. When it came to enslaved African families, families had no surnames, and so what's the price of that? There's no way to trace. It's very hard to trace families in the same way that we can trace our families. I can trace my family back to the actual date that we arrived in North America. It was in 1774. And I can do that because I can trace my family surname. But you can't do that if your surname is the name of the people who enslaved your ancestors. And so that's one of the reasons it's very hard to understand, like the African American family, you know, post or pre-emancipation because there were no surnames. Marriage and family and parental rights were not recognized. If you were an enslaved person and you got married, that wasn't respected in the same way if you were a free person and you got married. Families, parents had no rights over their children. Their children were the property of the people who presumed to own the family. They didn't have families, the parents didn't have any rights over their kids, and families were routinely separated and sold. And so we see this lack of family stability and lack of family structure because it was forced upon an entire group of people. And so we have to remember that and consider that. And we're not really going to be able to discuss African American families until after emancipation because there really wasn't, the structure didn't exist in the same way as it did for white families because there just wasn't a legal structure. The lack of legal structure oftentimes makes it very difficult for a thing to exist. As we'll talk about as we move forward in the discussion of the history of the family, especially when we get to the discussion of LGBTQ families, where there wasn't legal recognition and so the structure didn't exist in the same way. All right, for next time, I want you to send me an email if you have any questions about Class 4. Also, I know we talked about some kind of difficult topics when we got to the discussion of the enslaved African families. If you're kind of having trouble with that or want to talk about it, then let me know. I'm happy to process it with you. Keep working on homework 4. Remember, it is due tomorrow at 11:59 p.m. So please work on that. Read pages 45 to 59 in your textbook and then watch the Class 5 lecture. Hope you have a good day, and I will see you next time.